What would have been so harmful that it was forgotten for 100 years? Why did 30 lives disappear and never come back? And why does it still seem like the dirt in this forgotten part of South Carolina keeps track? To ensure you don't miss any of our investigations, subscribe to the channel right once and enable notifications if you want to follow true stories that defy time and uncover hidden realities. The lowlands' summer heat was the kind that made the air heavy and stuck to people's skin and minds. Similar. The fields on the outskirts of the ancient Green Hollow property had long since given way to briars and weeds, overlooking a drooping barn whose roof had collapsed due to years of neglect. A rusted windmill stood like a lone sentry, its blades immobile. Despite the silent weight of stories no one wanted to share, the land felt abandoned in the silence. A gang of 4 young men, lured by idle curiosity and the excitement of trespassing, entered through a fence gap in the summer of 1987 and roamed around the ruins. Shafts of sunlight poured through the breaches in the barn's walls, swirling dust. Their weight made the wooden floor creak, and then one of them realized that part of it wasn't made of wood at all. Beneath the fallen beams, a square of rusty iron stuck out of the ground, its edges sucked in by mud and rubble. Though it was flush with the ground as if it were supposed to be hidden, the shape was definitely a door. The corroded surface was scratched by their boots as to clear it, they labored. They discovered aged hinges made of solid iron beneath layers of rotten straw and wet earth. The slight but foul odor that emanated from the small opening seemed older than the men themselves. One of them claimed to have heard the hollow echo of space below when he put his ear to the cold metal. In their quest for a handle, they discovered nothing but a loop of chain with the ends welded shut with a crust of corroded iron and threaded through a metal clasp. Crude marks appeared at the edge of the plate, where it had not been completely absorbed by the dirt. They were deep incisions, in the form of rudimentary crosses and interconnecting arcs. But they were not words, at least not in any language they knew. Someone had carved the year 1856 in the top corner. The figures crooked as though they had been etched quickly. They traced the grooves with their fingertips, the clay flaking away to show the entire lines, and the air seemed to get thicker around them. The figures felt out of place here, as though it belonged to an other, riskier century. Encouraged by the discovery, one of the young guys pounded the clasp with a hammer they had carried, but the hit sounded metallic and harsh, and the lock remained immobile. They kept trying until the sound of the blows seemed to be muffled and swallowed by the ground. Anxiety replaced frustration, and they took a step back, panting. The dull, pitted surface of the iron door remained stationary, but in a way rebellious, as if protecting what was underneath. As they went away, the barn appeared to hover above them, the locked door barely visible behind the ruins, despite the group's intention to return better prepared. As they arrived at the road, none of them talked, but they all carried the image of that iron square in the soil and the odd conviction that something was still waiting below, in the stale blackness that had been unlit for almost a century. There had been no reference to the Green Hollow estate, and its name persisted in the margins of ancient county maps, but it was not mentioned in any official document for decades. Brittle parchment and faded writing described rivers that had shifted its path, roads that had been engulfed by forest growth, and boundaries that were vanished. There were no images of the property in the local archives. Instead, there were handwritten ledger descriptions, the majority of which predate the Civil War. Despite their thinness, the entries had an odd weight. Abrupt declines in output and crop inventories that are far higher than what the acreage could have produced without justification, and most oddly, special holdings notes were never fully specified. The name of the estate was written in faded pencil on a box in the county courthouse's basement, surrounded by dust-covered paperwork that had not been touched in years. A bundle of letters bound with brittle twine was found within. The paper was frail and foxed, and the ink was brown with age. One letter, written in a cramped, rushed style, was dated August 1856. It mentioned discord among the 30 but did not identify them. The author, who went by Thomas R., stated that the lower rooms were to stay sealed until further notice, and that his father had taken the required steps to restore order. The tone of another unsigned message was even colder. It was sent to a Charleston merchant, telling him not to ask why goods were delayed. There was a sense of something gone horribly wrong despite the precise, almost coded wording. Water rationing was mentioned, along with containment, words that seemed out of place in a farming setting. After reading the letter, the addressee was advised in the last paragraph to destroy it. Instead, for some reason, it had ended up in a box in the basement of a courtroom. More pieces surfaced as the archives were searched more thoroughly. Heavy iron hardware, hinges, chains, and locks were purchased from a Savannah blacksmith, according to a shipping record dated early 1856. No further sale or transfer of these objects was documented. A tiny diagonal line had been traced through, the official seal on the manifest, as if to strike it out of the record without completely removing it. Though none specifically addressed Green Hollow, journals from other farms alluded to trouble upriver. One described a region where light does not reach, while another spoke cryptically about the pit. According to popular stories, however, the estate appeared to be virtually undetectable, as though its owners might remove it whenever it was convenient for them. In contrast to other plantations, distinct histories, but this one was a shadow, its contents hidden, its intent hidden. Though it was more absence than presence, a pattern had started to emerge by the end of that winter's studies. Although the estate was never explicitly mentioned in official accounts, it was always present in the background of rumors and half-truths, echoing faintly in the historical record. Each paper seemed to be a fragment of something much bigger, purposefully hidden, as if the narrative itself had been imprisoned, covered with iron, and allowed to decay in the shadows. When the property was transferred and the documentation finally permitted a legal descent, they came back. Under timbers and jacks, the iron door reluctantly lifted, and what lay below was colder than the season permitted, a breath that appeared to emanate from a more ancient climate. A narrow mouth led to steps made of stone and clay, with uneven treads and slick risers where they had been polished by prolonged moisture. The first sound was that of water in the distance, not flowing but ticking as though it were keeping track of time in droplets that were too patient to look. With each step, the body was pressed into the earth that exhaled as the staircase spun repeatedly. Shallow grooves and a smattering of gouges at reach height were visible on the walls. Hair had snagged and calcified into brittle threads where the ceiling sank, while in other places the clay was packed with a straw that had darkened into fibrous veins. The corridor shortened and leveled after the last step, causing shoulders to tilt, something older that clung to the back of the air and tasted of metal tongue. Although the chamber was small, it had been separated into cells that were unworthy of the word by rudimentary partitions. Mortared into stone, iron rings sat knee-high, their arcs worn smooth in one way. Scores had been cut with something frantic and sharp on one wall. Brief, repeated sets, followed by a break before starting over. A handprint formed from a collection of prints in another corner. Along the arc, each finger was repeated as if practicing an escape that never materialized. Low constellations of soot, a remnant of flame too tiny to completely light anything, were visible on the ceiling. The metal base of a lantern was flattened as though by a heel, the rim of a gourd was aerated to paper thinness, and a wooden spoon was twisted into a crescent shape. A bucket filled with mineral bloom stood close to the middle, its inside encircled by a pale ring that indicated the locations where water had previously reached and then repeatedly withdrawn to a lower degree of pity. A shallow trough had been, filled with clay and buried along the floor. A wooden plug covered a hole at one end that no one could follow. There was the stench of thirst's afterlife. The soil had already done the mourning, so there was no drama when bones appeared. A collection of tiny phanges rested close to a cell's entrance, resembling counters left over from a poorly played game. A heel bone farther in displayed a tidy round hole where leather and iron may have met. Fragile seams formed from carbonized textile threads. A thumbnail-wide button was lying facing down. Every time the ground above recalled the weight of storms, its eye broke, its teeth loose from their stories, and it lay in dust that had sifted from the ceiling. A second doorway, narrower than the first, stood against the far wall and was accessed by a gate with square, unadorned bars. The bar had been slashed in, but the lock had long before shattered, transformed the wire into scarlet lace. It was as though the earth had learnt to drink the darkness that curved the way beyond the gate and did not reduce when light was entered. The same rudimentary arcs and crosses that were visible on the iron above were carved on the threshold by someone, along with a series of numbers that could be read as names, days, or neither. 30 in one column, followed by 30 again. Somewhere, below or beyond, the ticking of that patient blended into the stillness until it was inseparable from breathing. Amid the silence, the room made its own climate. A stillness that seemed like a promise honored, a dampness that refused to let, the flesh in and a breath out of stone. A faint thread of frigid air slipped through the enclosed corridor, as if reporting on rooms that had not been designed to be vacated, and dust gathered on the backs of the iron rings. The earth had recalled what it had been instructed to maintain, even in the absence of a verdict or witness. At first, word of the secret room spread slowly, through chats in barbershops and laundry rooms, then found its way into the nooks of church porches. Sunday worship. As if asking questions were a summons, older inhabitants rarely asked queries. When the kids played too near the old fence line, the retired midwife remembered how her mother would stifle them, stating only that the ground ran deep there. A mail carrier recalled dogs circling wide without being warned and refusing to cross that section of road. The estate passed from map to memory during these interactions, and memory molded it into what the county had always known, but not out loud. The way silt rises when a river is disturbed gave origin to names. A deacon prepared a family Bible with words smudged by wear and sorrow and penciled remarks in the margins. Taken to Hollow, 1856, 30 gone, was the simple line that appeared between births and baptisms. The ink did not provide any further details. It didn't have to. A piece from a newspaper that was long out of print was brought by a teacher, its section with a brief comment regarding labor difficulties upriver and a harvest shortage. In a language she never learned, an 80-year-old woman recounted a lullaby her grandmother had sang, a song with a counting pattern that stopped at 30 and started over before it reached 31. With cautious courtesy and the custom of a profession founded on suspicion, the county historian accepted these articles. He hypothesized that the chamber may have been a storage hole that was modified throughout time or an ice house. He pointed to instances from other estates where underfloor rooms have been used for benign and useful purposes. He indicated drainage by pointing to the trough, lamps by pointing to the soot, and cattle restraint by pointing to the rings. There was no harshness in his tone, just the firm insistency of a man who had been taught to keep his feet on the ground. But even he stopped when he saw the numerals in their unyielding columns and the marks carved into the stone. Documents were brought by descendants. His sentences were hefty, scant bits that were shielded from the elements and apathy. First names and tallies were listed on a ledger page. As if to keep from forgetting, the final total was emphasized. Twice. An inventory that had been hurriedly modified, reducing the head count by precisely 30 and stating temporary relocation without destination, was produced by a guy who traced his ancestry to a nearby plantation. During discussions that continued into the evening, these families discussed when letters were risky to transport, news had spread from mouth to mouth through tangled strands between homes. No verdicts were requested. All they needed was for the narrative to acknowledge that it had occurred. Clean borders were rejected by other reports. When a brush fire started to creep toward the old barn in the 1960s, a volunteer firefighter recounted being called to the scene. He discovered a heat that seemed to be coming from beneath the earth, but no flames. On quiet nights in the 1940s, a guy who worked in the nearby fields recalled hearing metal strike metal, a sourceless sound that slowed as he got closer and resumed as he left. One nurse related how she once treated a toddler for night terrors after he fell asleep on the doorway of the barn after a dare. The youngster awoke certain that someone had been whispering endless numbers next to him while they counted. Citing budgetary constraints and property rights, the sheriff's office remained neutral. However, in a brief report, an auxiliary deputy who had been discreetly dispatched to patrol the perimeter spotted footprints that appeared to have come from and gone from the ground. The county board discussed whether to mark the location in order to highlight the existing pain. During the assembly, a pastor's voice carried. He claimed that since the property had been holding a debt, it was only fair that it be given a name. At the conclusion of the week, a deal was made that no one was completely satisfied. Until the papers were cataloged, the room would stay closed. No sign would yet be erected, and the location would be referred to be historic. The town discovered a new quiet in the silence that followed these decisions. Without realizing it, people changed their routes. Out of stubbornness or superstition, some people left water jars along fence posts. This was a common practice that no one claimed. At night, the unproven counting continued in the imagination, resuming at strange times like a song when the mind is free. There were not many echoes. They remained stable. A ledger's balance in a currency that predates coins. Once summoned up, the murmur of a story refused to go completely down. Decisions regarding Green Hollow have to be taken in formal chambers at this point. Preservation organizations pushed for excavation in order to open to air and record every sealed corner. Others demanded that the land remain untouched, citing respect for the deceased without going into specifics about what that regard entailed. Meetings ended in deadlocks, with lengthy silences that weren't considered proper. At the same time, the property itself appeared to be in a state of waiting, neither inhabited nor deserted, yet it was unwilling to give up. After a season, nature started to reclaim more deliberately. Ivy slipped across the opening of the old barn, seemingly testing the strength of the iron door's hinges by fingering them. Rain drew in the low spots and then disappeared, nourishing the invisible areas below. The fence line's wooden posts began to sag more, and the wire began to twist into loose spirals. Long strokes of wind brushed across the grass, bending and rising as if speaking inaudibly to something below. The terrain seemed to slowly conceal itself by folding in on itself during the quiet months. In the county offices, the gathered papers were classified and placed in boxes, but they were not put on exhibit. They were put in a back room where the dust settled uniformly and the fluorescent light hummed. The ledgers underlined totals, the letters crooked script, and the shipping manifests faint diagonal lines. It was all still. In the margin of her notebook, a clerk tasked with inventorying them wrote that a few pages had a subtle iron and mildew smell, as though the years spent underground had not entirely released. Nobody followed up on the observation. After being written and initialed, it was placed in the same file as the others. There was virtually no notice before the official shutdown. One morning, a team of workers secured the barn and its underground door with sheet metal and lumber. By nightfall, the entry had vanished beneath a temporary wall painted the drab shade of utility sheds. There was simply a brief notation in the tourist maps, no plaque and no record. Local newspaper regarding a property that has been declared hazardous for public use. For most, the explanation was adequate, but not for those who had heard the slow tick of water in the dark and had walked the steps into the soil. In the months that followed, locals talked less about the place, not because they had forgotten, but because talking about it tended to draw attention to it. According to some, the counting has ceased. Others asserted that it had just changed pitch, becoming lower and more difficult to detect unless the night was extremely quiet. Some kept putting water jars along the fence posts, but they disappeared, faster than they had previously. Their absence went unnoticed, but was noted. The ancient maps with the name of the estate were still stored in drawers. Every year, the penciled lines get thinner, but never completely disappear. A surveyor drawing a new border for a nearby property is the last recorded reference to it. Near the location of the former barn, he observed that his compass stumbled, and the needle shook before settling a few degrees off true. Although he acknowledged that the magnitude of the deviation was remarkable, he noted in his log that it was probably caused by metal in the ground. He didn't stay behind to look. The clearing was almost completely engulfed by growth by that point, and the air there seemed to belong to a different depth, where time was still measured by water and ledgers were still open. 30 names and patient drops were neither retained, not lost, or found.